Welcome back, friends. Today we're going to make a leather holster. This is a pancake style holster. I added some leather tooling there, which is totally optional. Keep in mind, I'm not an expert. I am definitely not a professional. So I've made a few of these in the past and thought that I would share with you how I go about doing that in case you're interested in giving it a shot yourself. The materials you're going to need are leather, of course. I recommend an 8 to 9 ounce veg tan leather, waxed thread, and a needle that you can get the thread through. Glue of some sort, doesn't matter if it's Gorilla Glue, super glue, leather glue. As long as it bonds leather, that's really all that matters. A leather stain and finish, paper or cardboard for a pattern, and an optional snap closure and the setting tools for that if you want to add a retention strap. As far as tools go, a sharp knife, pencil and pen, scissors, spring clamps, or a stack of books to apply clamping pressure, a drill or leather punch, and if you want to add the tooling pattern, you'll need some leather carving tools and a pattern for that. So anyway, hope you enjoy the video. Let's get into it. So before we start cutting leather, we need to design this holster. I'm going to start by using a piece of cardboard. You can use paper, whatever. This is just a cracker box. And we're going to lay my belt on there to start with. And then I'm going to lay the gun in question, which of course is unloaded. Be mindful of safety, of course. And I'm going to figure out where I want the gun in relation to the belt. If I want a cant one way or the other, if I want it to be pretty perpendicular, I tend to like mine canted about like that. And I'm going to ride as deep as I can on it. This is a pretty heavy gun. So the deeper it rides, the more stable it's going to be. So once I kind of figure that out, I'm going to start by just drawing my belt on here. I'm just going to trace a couple parallel lines for that. And then we can kind of get placement of the handgun in question on there about where we want that. And then I'm going to trace that out. All right, so there we've got our gun traced on there. I hope you can see it okay on the camera. I don't know how the lighting is in here. Now from here, we have to define the shape of the holster. And before I even do that, I want to go ahead and decide where the belt slots are going to go. I generally like to have one a little, about as close as I can over here, making sure I leave enough room for stitching. I want to do my stitching along the gun about half the thickness of the gun away. So if I look, kind of eyeball that, I want to go about half that thick away for the stitching here. So I'm just going to draw some hash lines all the way down. And that one's a straight line. And then on this side here, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to start up here and just do my hash lines there. Now, going a little ways away from that stitch line there, I'm going to go ahead and draw a slot there, and I like to make sure it goes beyond the belt about 1/4 of an inch on both sides. And then I'm going to do the same thing over here, and this one I think I can angle this way. There we go. Now I've kind of got, I've figured out where I need to do my perimeter of the holster. I want to go past the muzzle. So we're just going to draw a line there. Again, about a quarter, maybe 3/16 of an inch past the muzzle. And then this slot, I want to make sure to leave plenty of meat around that. I don't want a weak point for the leather to tear. And then I can just come down and pick that up thusly. And this side, much the same, just leaving plenty of meat on that. There we go. Now, the top of the holster is a little bit more complicated to define. This might require a little bit of playing with. First of all, I want the trigger guard covered, and I'm going to be fine there as if I just come right across the top of the belt, or the top of the slots, the belt slots anyway. So let's just, I'm going to do a kind of a fine line to connect those, a light line. And that would probably be sufficient. However, with this one, I want to try to make a retention slot. Now, this is the front panel that I did here. The back panel, I like to come up and have a little bit of a sweat guard. So anything behind there. So that back panel is probably going to look something more like that. But with this one, for the front panel, like I said, I want to put a retention strap on here, so I'm going to come up this way, and it's basically going to lay right across this point right here, right behind, well, in front of the hammer, I guess, right behind the slide. So if you can imagine the gun sitting there, I want that retention strap to come up and over, and then it's going to turn behind and have a snap. At least that's the plan. So to facilitate that, I'm just going to basically, I'm going to keep that about as wide as I can, and I'm going to extend it further than I think I'm going to need, just so that when I cut my leather, I have plenty of length there, and I can always trim that off later. Let's see, I want to make that just a little bit wider. There we go. So now I'm going to go ahead and cut out what I've got here, and I'm not going to cut this or this here just yet. I'm going to cut the biggest, I'm basically going to cut the outside of everything. So I'm going to include my strap here, and I'm going to include the sweat guard back here. And then this line that differentiates the two, and here, we're going to use this pattern for both pieces of leather. And we'll show you how we're going to do that here in a minute. The next thing to do is going to be to cut that out, and I'm going to go ahead and do that off camera because you don't want to see that anyway. All right, now that I've got the entire outline cut out, I shaded in the parts that are only the back panel and left the front panel pieces unshaded. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and cut this part off so that we're left with only the back panel portion. We're going to use that pattern, and then we're going to tape this back on and go ahead and cut out our back panel pieces. We just want to make sure to hang on to that because we're going to need it for the front panel. Now our leather has two sides, a nice smooth side and then a more suede side on the back. So this particular piece has a big old blemish right here. So it would work fine for the back panel piece, but actually we want it to go this way. I like the suede side towards the firearm. So once I figure out how to lay that on there with as little waste as possible, I'll go ahead and trace that right onto my leather and cut the leather out. Now, a good sharp knife will work real well for this, but I like to use trowel shears, at least to start. Then I'll sometimes come back with a knife to clean it up if I need to, depending on how good of a job they do. We're going to dress those edges down the road anyway, so it really doesn't matter how smooth that cut line is. We just want to make sure that we get our line. We want to make sure to cut on our line here. All right, there's our back panel as it'll sit. Now, like I said, we're going to cut out these shaded portions that were only for the back panel, and then we'll tape our strap portion back on. Now, we can save these if we want to be able to make another holster for the same gun down the road. All right, now we're going to do that same thing for the front side. And again, we want the nice side of the leather showing for the front side. So we want to make sure to avoid any damaged areas. And all of this down here looks pretty good. So I think I'm probably just going to go about like that. All right. Now you can see how those two are going to go together there, about like that. And then this is going to bend over and have a snap back here. So the next thing we want to do, we want to take our front panel and we're going to transfer some more marks to that, not only for the slots, but for our stitch lines. And I'm going to use a punch or a nail to just punch right through the template into the leather to leave marks in the back there. So first I'm just going to mark each end of that slot. Maybe. And then I'm going to come down this stitch line and just mark every so often, just so that I know to follow that. And I'm not trying to punch all the way through the leather. I just want to make a good indentation so that I know where to go. I'll do the same with this stitch line. Now from here, you can keep going without tooling this front leather, but I want to tool this, add some design work to it. So, but if you don't want to do the tooling, you don't have to. You can go ahead and skip this part, but I'm going to go ahead and wet this now to prep it for tooling. Now, while I'm waiting for my leather to soak up the water to make it toolable, I need to make a tooling pattern. And I want my tooling to be between the stitches on this front panel here. So I'm just going to cut through the stitch lines here and use that as a pattern to make a stencil for the tooling. So that's the area that I'm going to tool. And I'm just going to put it right on this transfer paper or plastic or whatever. And then I can get my tooling pattern transferred on there. So I have this pattern from an old checkbook kit from Tandy that I like, and I'm going to use this for my holster. I'm just going to take my acetate with the panel outline that we want to carve, and I'm going to lay it on there and trace that onto here. Now that I've got that pattern traced on there, we're going to line it back up with our wet leather and trace that on there with this here. And we're just gonna rub that point right through the lines into the leather, and that's gonna leave a little indentation there that we can follow with our swivel knife. Now that we've got our lines transferred onto that, we're gonna go ahead and cut them out with a swivel knife. They're a little bit hard to see now, but they'll be a lot more defined once we have our knife marks laid in. Next, I'm going to start defining the shape more with stamps and a mallet. And I always like to work on a piece of sacrificial board there. Now that I've got that design looking the way I like it, I'm going to let this dry before moving on to the next step, which is gluing the front and back together. Now, if I was using something like Gorilla Glue that requires moisture to work, I would go ahead and glue it while it's wet. That'd be fine, but I'm using a leather cement like this, and it works better when it's dry, so I'm going to go ahead and just let that dry out. Now that this is dry, I'm going to go ahead and glue these two panels together. We're just going to line them up and apply glue along these two edges right here. I want to make sure not to get any glue inside of the stitching lines here and here. This area here we want free and open for the firearm, so we want to keep our glue close to these edges here. And it doesn't have to be a super firm bond. The stitching is going to give it most of the strength, but I find it much easier to stitch if they're glued together. So we're going to just pull these apart, put some glue here and here, and then clamp them together. And I like to use little spring clamps or binder clips, clothespins even. It all works. Now that we've got it well clamped, we're just going to wait for the glue to set up, and then we can stain it. Now that the glue's dry, I'm about ready to stain this, but first we need to address these edges a little bit. First, I'm going to use a sharp knife to even them up a little bit. And that's just making sure that they're nice and straight and smooth, and both panels are really well aligned. And then I'm going to take a beveler and just bevel that edge so it's got a nice round profile. And that'll also cut off any little bit of ink that I may have left with my cut lines from before. To clean up these loose fibers here, I'm just going to use some emery cloth. This is a pretty coarse grit. I think it's 80 or 100 grit, but that'll make pretty quick work of cleaning up those loose fibers there. Now with some cotton balls, I'm going to use this stain here, and I like to use a gloved hand because I don't like my fingers to be stained. But we're just going to rub that in circular motions, making sure to fill all the little nooks and crannies in the stamp. I want to keep it moving so that it doesn't build up in any one place in particular, and keep a nice even coating there. Now that our stain's dry, we're going to go ahead and cut our slots out. Normally I would use a punch to punch out both ends and then connect the holes with a sharp knife. I don't know where my punch is, so I'm going to use a drill bit. Then we're going to punch our stitching holes out. We're going to go along these stitch lines we marked before, and then we're also going to go around the perimeter except for where we want it open near the muzzle and along the top here. But we'll have two shapes, one on each side, that contain our belt slots. Now there you can see I've drilled a hole at each end of my slot, and then using a straight edge I scored it on both sides where I want to cut through, and then I'll just work my way through with this sharp knife, and I'll have a belt slot. So there you can see I've made my way through, and I've got one slot. Now to do the other. For stitching holes, you can either use chisels like these to make your holes, or you can use a small drill bit. I'm going to go ahead and use a small drill bit because not everybody has these. There we've got all our stitching holes drilled. I like to try to keep them between around 3/16 of an inch apart. Now I'm just going to use a tan waxed thread and a pretty good sized needle here. It's got a blunt tip on it, but it'll get its way through the leather just fine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start in the back at a relatively random spot, and I'm just going to pull quite a bit through and then go back down in the next hole and then pull that through and come back up the one after that. And it's going to look kind of like a skip lacing at this point, but then we're going to turn around and we're going to come back the other way. But I'm going to go all the way around this way and then turn around and come back the other way. So I've gotten all the way around my perimeter from where I started, and now I've gone around and back up, and I've ended here. Now, if I came back through the hole that I started, I would just go back the other way. But what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to keep going the way that I started. The number of holes worked out to be such that I could just keep going in that same direction. And now I'm connecting each one. So when I come through there, I'm going to bridge the gap left in my first course. And as I continue around, I will just keep going, and we're going to have, instead of skipping a section in between each of these, now we're connecting those, we're filling those blank spots as we go along. Now that I've come back around on the other side, you can see I've got no section or space between holes that doesn't have lace. So I've ended on the back here. I've got my starting and my stopping point. I'm just going to trim those to a few inches long, and then I will tie it off with a square knot, making sure that it's good and snug. That waxed thread is quite easy to tie because it doesn't slip. And then I'm going to go ahead and trim those off, leaving just a little bit hanging there so that it doesn't come untied. And it'll just stick down there with the wax. Now, to do the other side. Now that our stitching is done, comes the moment of truth. We can actually try to test fit the firearm that we made it for. If it's a little bit too snug, if it won't go in, you can dampen the leather and it'll become kind of stretchy. And then use an analog for your firearm to kind of stretch it out and hold the position while it dries. You don't want to use blued steel firearm, of course, because it'll rust something terrible if you stick it in a wet leather holster. But that is one option that I've resorted to before. Now the only thing left to do before we finish this up is going to be to clear coat it and then set our snap for our retention strap back here. Now to wrap this up, we're just going to add a snap for our retention strap here. So I've got that strap tucked in there where I want it, and then I'm going to use a sharp tool to mark through the back panel and the strap both in one point where I want my snap location to be. So I'm just going to kind of move it around and eyeball it and see where exactly I want that snap to be located. And I think about there is good. Now I'm just going to work that in carefully through the back panel until it makes a mark on the strap itself without going too far and damaging the firearm, of course. So now let's pull that strap out and see if we've got a mark in there, and we do. Perfect. So now we're going to go ahead and remove the firearm, punch our holes in both of those pieces, and then set our snap. Now the snap comes in 4 pieces here. We've got the male and female parts of the snap, and then the backers for both of them. Generally the female has the round button, and then the male has a flat back rivet, basically. So when you're locating those, you want to make sure to get everything in a spot that is going to work for you. There we go. And there you have it. We've got our snap in place. And that's a wrap.